Read Plato's Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is primarily known for the challenge it poses for religious ethics, or really any ethics based on some authoritative figure at the end of the dialogue, called Euthyphro's dilemma. It's called that even though it's Plato who came up with the dilemma and Socrates, not Euthyphro, who deploys the dilemma within the dialogue. But we are going to use the dialogue to get a sense of two things. One, and it is the focus of this video, is the nature of definitions. The other, and this is something you will hopefully absorb to some extent on your own, is the nature of the Socratic method. All right, so if we're focusing on definitions, what is being defined? It's pretty standard in Plato's early dialogues for there to be a single concept that's the focus of the discussion that the discussants are attempting to define. The topic of the discussion for this dialogue is the nature of piety. Now, one thing to mention here is that definitions normally concern words. Words are the things you define. But Socrates is not actually trying to define a word. He is trying to give an account of a thing, a real thing, not the word for that thing. Now, the two tasks are not entirely distinct, of course. What thing is Socrates trying to define? Well, the property that all pious things have, which seems like it is going to be the property held by all the things we use the word pious to describe. So there's a connection between the word and the thing. The way to look at this dialogue is to focus on the mistakes that Euthyphro makes in his attempt to define piety. His first attempted definition is that piety is, or according to him, I say what is pious is what I am doing now. Socrates' response is basically that Euthyphro hasn't done what he was asked to do. He hasn't given a definition. But in a way, he has. Euthyphro was asked for a definition, and he gave an example. This is sometimes called an ostensive definition. Imagine a situation where you are working with tools and you ask somebody to hand you the level, and they asked you what a level is. You then point to the level and say, that is a level. This is a way of defining things. Like I said, it's called ostensive definition. Effectively, you define something by pointing at that thing. The word ostend means to point. But this is often not a very good way of defining things, which is why Plato has Socrates complain about it. When you are defining something, you are rarely going to be talking about just one object or just one thing. There are, as Socrates points out, many pious things, many things that the word pious appropriately applies to. The problem with an ostensive definition is that what you are really doing with an ostensive definition of something, say X, is saying X is that thing, whatever you're pointing at, and other things like the thing I'm pointing at. But the problem is, you can take any object and find similarities between it and very different kinds of objects. For example, suppose someone wanted you to define the word mammal. Using an ostensive definition, you might then point to a nearby mammal. So far, so good. But let's say you point to a cat. That's the nearest mammal to me right now, other than myself. What you are essentially saying is that mammals are cats and things that are similar to cats. But similar to cats in which way? Lots of things are true about cats. They have fur and nurse their young, for example. And if you're lucky, those two features are what the person will focus on, because those two features are features you would use to define what a mammal is. But cats are also carnivores and four-legged. If the person thinks that you had those features in mind when you pointed at the cat, they will conclude that cows and bats aren't mammals, but that Komodo dragons are, because Komodo dragons are four-legged carnivores. Cows aren't carnivores, and bats aren't four-legged. This is the problem with ostensive definitions. And because of those problems, Plato has Socrates push for something more informative. What Socrates wants is what he calls the form of piety. It is what all pious things share, and presumably something no non-pious thing has. In more contemporary language, what Socrates is asking Euthyphro for are the necessary and sufficient conditions of piety. A necessary condition of piety would be some property or quality that all pious things must have in order to be pious. A sufficient condition of piety would be some property or quality that, if something has that property or quality, well, that thing must be pious. So let's say you're trying to define something. Let's call the thing you're trying to define X. If you are claiming that something, and let's call that B, is a necessary condition of X, a property that is a necessary condition of X, then you are saying the following. If something, C, is an X, then C is B or has B. For example, let's say we are defining mammals, since I used that example before. So X equals mammals. And we are saying that fur is a necessary condition of being a mammal, or having fur is. So B equals fur. Fur is a necessary condition for mammals. So then we can say something like a cat, that if it is a mammal, then it has fur. If you are defining X, on the other hand, and saying that B is a sufficient condition for X, then you're saying if something C is or has B, then it is X. And so, compare and contrast that with the formula on the previous slide for necessary conditions. You'll see there's a slight difference there. For an example, being a dog is a sufficient condition for being a mammal. So we can say, if a Chihuahua is a dog, then it is a mammal. Now, if Euthyphro gives a definition of piety in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, this will allow Socrates to do what he thinks a good definition will allow him to do, which is using it is the definition, as a model, say that any action of yours or another's that is of that kind is pious, and if it is not, that it is not. But of course, just providing necessary and sufficient conditions is not enough for a good definition. They have to be the correct necessary and sufficient conditions. For example, suppose I tried to define horse, the term horse, or the thing horse, and I said that all horses are fast and all four-legged animals are horses. The first claim, all horses are fast, provides a necessary condition for being a horse. And the second, all four-legged animals are horses, provides a sufficient condition for being a horse. But both of these claims are incorrect. Take the first claim that all horses are fast. This is false. Not all horses are fast. A horse that is old or unhealthy might be quite slow, or unable to walk around at all. But it would still be a horse. This necessary condition is too narrow, in that it excludes things from the category horse that belong in that category. The second claim, that all four-legged animals are horses, is of course obviously false. Cows have 4 legs and are not horses. This sufficient condition is too broad, in that it includes things in the category horses that are not horses. To avoid necessary conditions that are too narrow and sufficient conditions that are too broad. We should also strive to avoid the problem Euthyphro encounters with his first attempt to give a definition with necessary and sufficient conditions. Euthyphro says that what is dear to or loved by the gods is pious, and what is not dear to the gods is impious. And this manages to give necessary and sufficient conditions. The problem with this definition is that Euthyphro has already accepted earlier in the dialogue that the gods disagree with each other on many things. So his definition would, when combined with that entirely normal Greek religious belief that the gods fight over things, lead to the inconsistent conclusion that one and the same thing is both pious and impious. since some gods will love something and some gods will not love that same thing. The point here is that when we accept a definition, that has consequences for other things we believe. We need to check that our new definition, when combined with our other beliefs, does not lead to inconsistencies or absurdities. This is the whole point of the Socratic method. In a way, checking to make sure that your definition is not too broad or too narrow is a version of doing this. If you define horses in such a way that cows end up being categorized as horses, then you have taken your definition of horses as four-legged animals and combined it with your knowledge that cows and horses are different things, and realized that you have an absurd conclusion on your hands. That's what lets you know that that sufficient condition was too broad. But Socrates' point to Euthyphro is that sometimes these inconsistencies can be harder to detect, not so obviously wrong, or not so obviously present. It is not as though Euthyphro believing the stories about the Greek gods taking different sides, for example in the Trojan War, would obviously have anything to do with piety. But given the definition of piety he gave, it was relevant. We come now to the most famous section of the Euthyphro, where Socrates presents what has come to be known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro amends his earlier definition, so now it now says that what all the gods love is pious, and what all the gods hate is impious. He has therefore saved himself from the inconsistency Socrates identified, because of course, if the gods disagree, then it doesn't say anything at all. Now Socrates criticizes the definition on another basis, that the definition does not describe the essential nature of piety. He says, and this is Socrates, is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? The point here is that Euthyphro's third definition links two properties. Being loved by the gods and piety are the two properties. Socrates accepts that they are in fact linked. Socrates believes that it's true that what all the gods love is pious and what all the gods hate is impious. But Socrates is wondering which one of these properties explains which. Does the gods loving something make it pious? Or does something being pious make the gods love it? On one option, Euthyphro's definition works, and on the other, it does not. Let's start with the one that would work. If pious things are pious because the gods love them, then defining piety as what the gods love would be a good definition by Socrates' standards. That is because while Socrates does want a definition that will help him identify the things that have the property being defined, this is what he was talking about when he was talking about using the definition as a model, he also wants the definition to explain why the things that have that property have the property. He wants a definition of piety to tell you what it is about pious things that makes them pious. And if things are pious just because the gods love them, then defining piety as what all the gods love will do the trick for Socrates. That will be a good definition. You could then ask of some action whether it was pious, and with the definition in hand, you could tell whether it was or it wasn't. And if asked why it was or wasn't pious, the definition would tell you how to explain that fact. It is because the gods love it, or because they do not. The other answer to that question, what explains what, does not give us a good definition, though. If the gods love something because it is pious, as opposed to it being pious because they love it, then if we define piety as that which the gods love, we still might be able to use the definition as a model if, for example, we knew what the gods loved and what they didn't. But we won't be able to explain why pious things are pious, because the gods loving something isn't what makes it pious. That's because explanations don't work both ways. If A explains B, then B does not explain A. So if piety explains being God-loved, then being God-loved does not explain being pious. This is most often put in terms of essence. A good definition should describe the essence of the thing being defined. To see why, consider the following bad definition. A dog is whatever the consensus of zoologists says is a dog. Now, this definition does do a good job of giving you a way to tell what is a dog and what isn't, as long as you know what the consensus among zoologists is. In other words, it gives you necessary and sufficient conditions that are correct. But it doesn't tell you anything about dogs. It's a definition of dogs that doesn't tell you anything about dogs themselves, and that's why it's a bad definition. Someone could know this definition and not know the first thing about dogs. So what is essence? Well, essence is something, the essence of something is that set of features that makes something the kind of thing it is. Everything or every property that is not essential is what's called accidental. So for example, my dog is named Ruby. That her name is Ruby is a feature of hers, but it's an accidental feature of hers. It's not part of what makes her the kind of thing she is, a dog. My dog is a mammal, and that is a part of what makes her the kind of thing she is. Being a mammal is part of her essence. Essential properties will also tend to explain other properties something has. So, for example, my dog's being named Ruby doesn't explain much at all about her. If she wasn't named Ruby, nothing much else would change about her. But her being a mammal does explain quite a lot about her. Explains why her body is shaped the way it does, explains why she has fur, all sorts of other things. And a good test for whether something is an essential property is to try that same mental exercise I just did with my dog's name. I said that if her name wasn't Ruby, everything else would be basically the same about her. But try to imagine my dog not being a mammal, though. I can imagine her being named something other than Ruby. I can just imagine that we gave her a different name. But try to imagine her not being a dog. That doesn't even really make sense. Like, am I imagining my dog being some other kind of animal, like a reptile? How does that even make sense? How can I imagine a dog being a reptile? Wouldn't that just be me imagining that I have a lizard for a pet and not a dog at all? And certainly not this very dog. To Euthyphro's dilemma. Remember, there were two options in response to Socrates' question of Euthyphro's answer. Either A, the god's love explains why something is pious, or B, something being pious explains the god's love. And remember that if B is the answer, then Euthyphro's definition is bad. And the reason is that it doesn't provide an explanation of what makes pious things pious. And if A, then Euthyphro's definition is good, at least potentially. As long as that's true, that the god's love explains why something is pious. Now, why didn't they go with A? I mean, they went with B. Socrates asks the question of Euthyphro, and Euthyphro basically says B. So why not A? Well, the reason why is that would make piety conventional. So what does that mean? Something is conventional when it is decided by a group of people, or in other words, by a convention. Now, this is not meant explicitly, right? It's not like everything that's conventional, there was an actual convention that happened at a particular place at a particular time where people got together and decided it. It sometimes happens that way, but very often not. Very often these conventions are implicit, right? There's something that everybody agrees to, even though we never all sat around at a table and agreed to it. For example, which side of the road you should drive on is just a conventional fact, right? You're in the United States. There wasn't some time where everybody got together and decided that we should drive on the right side of the road, but nonetheless, we do all agree to that. It is a fact in the United States that you ought to drive on the right-hand side of the road, and that is a conventional fact. It's true only because we all agree that it's true. What else is conventional? Well, language is pretty clearly conventional. What words mean is conventional. A word only means the thing it does because we all agree to use the word that way. There's not really anything else to a word meaning what it does besides convention. Laws are obviously conventional, right? In fact, the which side of the road you should drive on thing is just a kind of law. And the laws are as they are because we've agreed to make them that way. But there's also things like rules of politeness are conventional, stuff like that. Right? So lots and lots of things are genuinely conventional. So why would it be a problem if piety is conventional? More generally, what you can say about conventionalism is this. Conventionalism is true about some area of discourse that you're talking about. And so conventionalism about X is the view that some set of truths, the truths about X, are only true by agreement. So facts about or truths about politeness are just determined by agreement. So conventionalism about politeness is the correct view. Now, conventionalism is connected to relativism, as is pretty clear from, say, the politeness example. What counts as polite in one society or culture does not count as polite in another society or culture. So it is polite to shake someone's hand in the United States when you meet them. It's polite in France to, upon encountering someone, a friend, say, to give a kiss on each side of the cheek. Right? That's polite in those countries. But if you go to other countries, you're not supposed to touch strangers. You're certainly not supposed to kiss people, right, who you barely know. What counts as polite changes from culture to culture. And that's connected to the fact that politeness is conventional. Politeness is just a matter of agreement. And there are different agreements in different parts of the world. There's an agreement in France, an implicit agreement. This is not one where, there was some formal legal decision that you kiss on each side of the cheek. But nonetheless, there's a sort of general agreement in most parts of France that this is the appropriate way to behave. And there's a general agreement in, say, Egypt that you don't do that. So what's relativism? Well, relativism about X is the view that there is no universal truth when it comes to X. Only different truths for different groups. This clearly seems true about politeness. Right? To the extent that it's true that something is or is not polite, it's only true relatively. It's only true relative to a certain group or a certain region or something like that. It's not true universally. There is no universal truth of about what is or is not polite. Politeness is just not the kind of thing for which that could be true. Why? Because it's purely conventional. Right? Think about language. Language is obviously relative to a group. The same sounding word can appear in multiple languages but mean different things in those languages. And that's because language is purely conventional. And where things depend upon agreement, and you have different agreements, you're going to have different truths. So conventionalism is related to relativism, and the important thing to realize is that Plato opposed relativism throughout his career. And all of his theories can be seen as ways to explain why relativism is not in general true. I want to stress in general there. It's not like Plato would have denied that language, well, actually there is a dialogue where Plato kind of seems to deny that that's true of names, but politeness, say. I don't think Plato would have denied that what counts as polite in one society or culture doesn't count as polite in another. He would have been aware that there were different customs in different places. Plato did not deny relativism about everything, but Plato did want to deny relativism about, for example, ethics or morality. He did not think that what was right or wrong to do, or Plato would have probably been more comfortable saying, he did not think that what was virtuous or vicious to do was relative. And because of that, he didn't want it to be conventional. Because of that connection between conventionalism and relativism. If you accept conventionalism about something, then the only way to avoid relativism about it is to claim that everyone in the world agrees, and everyone in the world will always agree and has always agreed, and that's just not plausible. So conventionalism usually leads to relativism. Plato objects to relativism about morality or ethics, as he does object to relativism about scientific issues. He also, rejects relativism about religious issues quite often. He thinks there are universally true right and wrong answers about these things. And so, because Plato rejects relativism about so many important things, which piety is a part, piety is a moral virtue, and Plato rejects relativism about virtue or morality. Because he rejects relativism, he's going to end up rejecting conventionalism, because he sees that conventionalism is going to lead to relativism fairly quickly. And that's why the version of Euthyphro's third answer, or third attempted definition, that works as a definition is just not even explored, because it's just not something Plato's willing to consider. Now, part of the reason to go through the Euthyphro dilemma, which we haven't explored all the different takes on this, all the different theories about this dilemma that have arisen over the thousands of years of thinking about it, especially in theology and the philosophy of religion. The reason for us to look at it is Plato's rejection of conventionalism and relativism points us toward the sort of key concept that's going to be important throughout this course. Because what's the opposite of a conventional truth? It's an objective truth. A conventional truth is true only because people think it's true. So it's true that you ought to shake hands when you meet somebody in the United States of America, but it's only true because people think that way, because people agree to that claim. That's what makes it conventional. The opposite, or the contrast with conventional truth, is objective truth. And so objective truth is truth that's true regardless of what anyone thinks, independent of what anyone thinks. That's the standard here. Objectivity, or objective truth, is something a proposition or a statement has when it's true no matter what anyone thinks about it. Now, Plato thinks there are objective moral truths, religious truths, scientific truths. Nowadays, almost everybody accepts that there are objective scientific truths. Most people think there are objective religious truths, although you do find some disagreement about that. And I think it's probably also true that most people believe in objective ethical truths, but that's probably the kind of truth that people are least likely to think can be objective, at least of the things that Plato was interested in. So Plato is after objective truths about the topics he investigates, and part of that is going to be rejecting any conventional definition or definition of any key concepts which makes them conventional, in the way that Euthyphro's definition, if you understood it so that the gods loving something makes it pious, would be conventional and not objective, because then its status as pious is determined by what someone, even though they're super powerful, magical, godlike beings, it would depend on what someone thinks about it or what some group of people think about it. And that's not what objectivity is. Okay, so that brings us to the final definition. Now, this one isn't actually provided by Euthyphro. Euthyphro has given up at this point. He's got 3 attempts, and they've all failed for different reasons, and so he just stops playing. So Socrates is the one that's going to provide this one. And what he asks is whether Euthyphro agrees that the pious is necessarily just. Right? So are pious actions also necessarily just actions, as in justice? And Euthyphro agrees. Socrates then gets him to agree that all pious things are just, but not all just things are pious. Basically, that the category of just things is larger than the category of pious things, because the category of justice, or just actions, contains the category of piety, or pious actions. They then go looking for something that would distinguish the pious things from the other things that are just, the just things that aren't pious. They fail at this task, and Euthyphro runs off to avoid having to talk to Socrates anymore. But it is worth thinking about this kind of definition. It is a version of what's called a genus-species definition. Basically, a genus-species definition selects a group that the thing defined is a part of, the genus, and then distinguishes the thing to be defined from the other members of the genus. So the thing being defined is the species, the wider class or set of which it's a part is the genus. Now, this does not fit the way biologists nowadays use the terms genus and species. Right? So in biology, there's a whole order, I forget how many parts there are to some 7 or something like that, ways of categorizing animals, and genus and species are just the 2 lowest ones. The way to remember how these terms are used here, how they were used originally really, is to focus on the fact that species is where we get our word specific, and genus is where we get our word general. So the genus is just the more general category, and the species is some specific part of that general category. For example, if I were defining dog, I would first identify its genus, which you might think is mammal. Because dogs are mammals, they have certain characteristics, like fur. There's a specific kind of ear and jaw structure that mammals have that non-mammals don't. They produce milk for their youngs, mammals do, and dogs have all that. But because dogs are dogs, they have some specific characteristics that other mammals don't have. Dogs have 4 legs. Dogs don't have wings. Dogs live on the land and not in the water, etc. If you put enough of those characteristics together, you can narrow things down enough to exclude every kind of mammal that is not a dog. And then you would have a good genus-species definition. Now, actual zoologists would do a better job than I just did of distinguishing dogs from other mammals, but you can see how this would work. Right? You find the class that dogs are part of, and then you find the things that dogs have that no other kind of mammals have. So we have certain rules for providing good definitions. Good definitions should identify necessary and sufficient conditions. They should not imply contradictions or absurdities, either on their own or when combined with your other beliefs. And they should describe the essential properties of the thing being defined. A genus-species definition can do all of that. You might have realized that my example of an essential property of a dog was also the genus I used in the genus-species definition, being a mammal. Right? I used that example earlier. Dogs are essentially mammals. It's part of their essence. It is also the case that being in the genus mammal is a necessary condition of being a dog. It's not a sufficient condition, of course, because lots of other mammals exist and they're not all dogs. But if you were to put the genus together, right, if you put being a mammal together with all the characteristics of dogs that distinguish them from other mammals, then you end up with a sufficient condition for being a dog. If something is a mammal and 4-legged and carnivorous and does not fly and lives on the land, etc., then it is a dog. So the genus-species definition, which is the last kind that Socrates tries in the dialogue, the Euthyphro, seems like it's going to be a good way to define things in the future. And this is a method of defining things that Plato will use again and again. And that's all I have to say about the Euthyphro. It took a while, but hopefully it was helpful.